The engine coughed its last, a fitting death rattle for the journey I just endured. Silence swallowed the sputter, thick and immediate, a suffocating blanket woven from the vast, empty fields that stretched in every direction. I cut the ignition, the final click echoing in the sudden quiet, and just sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel gripped tight. The old station wagon, packed to the roof with the sparse remnants of my life, seemed to sigh around me. Ahead, nestled deep within a tangle of overgrown oaks and weeping willows, stood the house. A skeletal sentinel against the bruised sky, it listed slightly to one side, as if perpetually caught in a gust of wind. Paint peeled in leprous flakes from its clapboard skin, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. It was an eyesore, a monument to decay, defiant against the defiant green that threatened to reclaim it entirely. It was perfect. I pushed open the heavy door, the groan of the hinges a fitting welcome. My boots scuffed on the grimy floorboards, each step sending up a cloud of history. I ran a hand over a banister, the wood rough and splintered, a fine layer of grit clinging to my fingertips. This was it, my fresh start. The bitter taste of the words lingered on my tongue. There was nothing fresh about me, not anymore. I was a ghost in my own skin, haunting a house that felt like it had been waiting for me. The first few hours were a blur of numb activity. I dragged in boxes, their contents still sealed, unwilling to confront the past they contained. I tried to pry open a window in the kitchen, the frame swollen shut with decades of neglect, and gave up with a frustrated grunt. The electricity was off, of course, the water too. I'd expected as much. This wasn't a quick fix, it was a total overhaul, a deliberate act of penance and rebuilding. A determined act. I would make this work. I had to. As dusk bled into night, I lit a single lantern, its feeble glow carving out a small circle of defiance against the encroaching gloom. The house, in the dim light, felt even larger, its unseen corners pressing in. Every creak of the old timbers, every rustle of leaves against the broken panes, took on a sinister edge. I told myself it was just the wind, just an old house settling. I decided to investigate the cellar, a pragmatic choice, I told myself, needing to locate the main fuse box or at least a water shut-off valve. I put my shoulder into it, grunting with effort, and it finally gave way with a shuddering sigh, revealing a gaping maw of blackness. The cellar was vast, far larger than I'd anticipated, its walls lined with shelves of empty, ancient canning jars, thick with dust and cobwebs. I moved slowly, running my hand along the damp stone walls, searching for a switch, a lever, anything. That's when I noticed it. A section of the wall deeper in the cellar was different. A faint, almost imperceptible draft emanated from it, carrying that same strange, metallic earthy scent. My curiosity, a dangerous flicker I thought grief had extinguished, compelled me forward. I knelt, scraping away at the soil with my bare hands. A latch. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled at it. It wasn't a root cellar or a coal chute. It was a passage, an underground tunnel system. The air that poured out of the newly revealed aperture was thick, heavy, and tasted of ancient rot and something else, something deeply unsettling. The beam was swallowed almost immediately, barely illuminating a few feet of rough-hewn passage before succumbing to the absolute blackness. The walls seemed to sweat, slick with an unseen moisture, and the floor, as far as I could tell, was uneven earth. This wasn't just a cellar. This house held secrets, secrets buried deep beneath its foundations. This wasn't the fresh start I'd envisioned. It was something else entirely, something ancient and waiting, and just sat there, the silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. The last sputter of the engine still vibrated in my teeth, a ghost of sound in the vast, empty quiet. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old like forgotten blood. The house loomed, a silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Getting out of the vehicle, the gravel crunched under my worn boots, a jarring sound in the oppressive stillness. I walked towards the porch, each step echoing too loudly in the evening's hush. The front door, a heavy slab of oak, groaned open with a reluctant sigh, revealing a maw of impenetrable gloom. My hand fumbled for the light switch I knew wouldn't be there, then remembered the battery-powered lantern in my bag. Its beam cut through the black, revealing dust motes dancing in the stale air, a testament to years of neglect. The entrance hall was cavernous, smelling of mildew and something else, a faint, sweet decay like dried flowers left too long in a forgotten vase. My breath hitched. It was just the house, I told myself, just old wood and stagnant air. I spent the first hour simply walking through the downstairs rooms, the lantern beams sweeping across peeling wallpaper and furniture draped in white sheets that looked like spectral figures. I told myself it was the house settling, the sounds of a forgotten structure coming back to life. But the stillness between those sounds was profound, a watchful quiet that felt less empty and more waiting. That night, I tried to sleep on a makeshift bed in what I decided would be the living room. A heavy woolen blanket pulled tight around me. The house sighed around me, a symphony of creaks and groans. I kept my lantern on low, casting a pale circle of light around my sleeping bag. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard a faint scratching like claws on wood coming from the walls near the fireplace. A mouse, I reasoned, just a mouse. But it persisted, a rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape that dug into my nerves. In the morning, the scratching was gone, replaced by a profound, unnerving quiet. I found a loose floorboard near the fireplace, slightly ajar as if something had pushed against it from below. I knelt, prying it open with my bare hands. Nothing there. Over the next few days, the subtle shifts continued. A window I was certain I'd latched would be slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of the cold air. A book I'd left on the kitchen counter would be on the floor, its pages splayed. Grief, I reminded myself, played tricks on the mind. But the draft was real. It was strongest in the basement, where the air was perpetually damp and smelled of earth and iron. I spent an afternoon down there trying to locate the source, convinced it was a structural flaw, a gap in the old stone foundation. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten storage, dusty shelves, and crumbling barrels. As I moved deeper, past a stack of ancient, moldering crates, I noticed a section of the wall that looked different. The stones were larger, more crudely fitted, and a faint seam ran vertically down the center. Curiosity overriding my growing unease, I ran my hand over the cold stone. The draft here was intense, an icy breath against my palm. I pushed, testing the seam, and felt a slight give. With a grunt, I leaned my weight into it. The stones, surprisingly, moved, scraping against each other with a sound like grinding teeth. My lantern beam, usually so confident, seemed to shrink, swallowed by the profound blackness. It was an entrance to something else entirely, an underground tunnel system. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me. This wasn't just a draft, this was a breath, exhaled from deep within the earth. And whatever lay within that underground tunnel system felt like it was waiting for me. Something metallic and old, like forgotten iron. I closed my eyes, the image of the house's shadowed maw still burned behind my eyelids. This move, this isolated retreat, was supposed to be a bomb, a fresh start. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something far worse. The next few days blurred into a monotonous cycle of restless sleep and waking unease. I found myself obsessively cleaning, scrubbing at ancient stains that clung to the floorboards like memories, polishing grime from windows until my reflection stared back, gaunt and haunted. Each chore was a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos that simmered beneath the surface of the house and within me. I tried to convince myself the metallic scent, the oppressive silence, was just the natural decay of a long-abandoned place. But a tremor in my hands, a constant knot in my stomach, told a different story. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The heavy oak door was shut, the windows latched. Yet the scent of damp earth, that same metallic tang, was stronger now, laced with something else, a faint, sickly sweetness that made my gorge rise. I stood there, rooted, listening. The house groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and wind-whipped eaves, but beneath it all I heard a different sound. A low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump, like a distant heartbeat or a slow, deliberate knock. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from below. A strange, magnetic pull drew me to the old stone hearth in the living room. My determination, born of a desperate need to understand, overrode the creeping fear. I knelt, tracing the seam with a trembling finger. Pushing against one of the larger flagstones, I felt a slight give. I pushed harder, grunting with effort, and with a grinding rasp the slab lifted, revealing a gaping blackness beneath. It was a smell I knew, a smell that had been seared into my brain, a smell I had tried for so long to forget. The smell of decay, yes, but also of something personal, something that echoed the deepest wound in my soul. I recoiled, my stomach churning. I grabbed a lantern from the mantelpiece, its beam carving a shaky circle out of the gloom. The opening was narrow, a crude tunnel descending into the earth. The walls were rough-hewn rock, slick with moisture, and the air grew heavy, thick with the unholy scent. Each step down the uneven stone steps was an act of sheer will. The thumping grew louder, seeming to resonate in my bones, a slow, agonizing drumbeat that mirrored the pulse in my ears. Not a distinct voice, but a collective sigh, a mournful exhalation that seemed to rise from the very stones. It was everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of sorrow. My breath hitched in my throat, her smile, her eyes, the way her hair caught the light. You could have saved her. One seemed to hiss. Your fault. Another sighed. Then the thumping stopped. A profound, suffocating silence descended, heavier than any I had known before. I held my breath, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the frantic beat of my own heart. I moved forward, my vision blurring with unshed tears, my mind reeling. The tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber, the air even thicker here, almost suffocating. My lantern beam swept across the rough walls, revealing something etched into the stone. Crude, ancient carvings, almost childlike in their simplicity, yet deeply disturbing. Figures, gaunt and twisted, their mouths open in silent screams. And beneath them, a single word carved deeper than the rest, stark and unforgiving: feed. My gaze dropped to the center of the chamber. There, on a raised slab of rock, lay a single mundane object. A child's wooden toy block. Not old, not weathered like the rest of the chamber. It was clean, almost new. And painted on its side in bright primary colors was the letter L. It was the same block, the very same one I had given her, the one she loved to play with. The one that had been lost in the chaos of that terrible day. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I stumbled back, hitting the rough wall, the impact jarring my teeth. The implications were too horrific to contemplate. This was something that reached into my life, into my grief, into the very fabric of my most personal tragedy. It knew. It remembered. The entity wasn't just in the house. It was in my head, a parasitic growth feeding on my despair, pulling me deeper into its terrifying, grief-stricken reality. I was isolated, yes, but now I was also being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. The next few days blurred, an indistinct wash of gray light and the persistent, gnawing awareness that I was not alone. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the creaks as settling wood, the sudden chills as drafts, the fleeting shadows as tricks of failing eyesight. I unpacked more boxes, arranged books on shelves, cooked simple meals I barely tasted. Anything to impose order, to feel grounded, to push back against the creeping dread that had begun to take root. But the house resisted. The floorboards groaned not just when I walked, but when I stood perfectly still. I started to hear a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws on stone, emanating from somewhere deep within the structure. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as mice or the wind, but it grew more insistent, more deliberate, always just beyond my immediate perception. One evening I was in the study attempting to read when a book slid from a high shelf and landed with a sharp thud at my feet. It wasn't just a tilt, it was a deliberate shove. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, but it was a book I had placed there myself moments before, quite securely. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. That night the scratching intensified, moving from the walls to beneath the floorboards of my bedroom. It felt like something was trying to dig its way up. I lay awake, heart thrumming against my ribs, listening to the relentless rasp. It seemed to coil around the contours of my thoughts, a language I didn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I couldn't sleep. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and something was rattling the bars. In the pre-dawn hours, driven by a desperate need to find the source, to confront whatever was making these sounds, I got out of bed. The scratching now seemed to emanate from the old cellar. The cellar was a cavernous space, smelling of damp earth and forgotten things. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from the low ceiling. The scratching was louder here, undeniably coming from the far wall, behind a stack of ancient, rotting crates. With a surge of adrenaline, I began to clear them away, my hands shaking. The wood was brittle, splinters digging into my skin. Behind the last crate, I found it. Not a wall, but a heavy, corroded iron door, almost completely swallowed by the surrounding stone. Its surface was pitted and scarred, the handle a rusted lump. A profound sense of unease washed over me, a warning that screamed at the edges of my consciousness. I had to know. It gave with a groan of tortured metal, swinging inward to reveal a narrow black maw. The air that rushed out was thick and cloying, heavy with the scent of stagnant water and something else, something metallic and old like forgotten iron. This was it, the entrance to the underground tunnel system. I hesitated, the flashlight beam swallowed almost immediately by the absolute blackness within. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to seal the door and pretend I'd never found it. But the house had already seeped into me, its mysteries demanding to be unraveled, its malevolence already taking root. I stepped inside, the iron door groaning shut behind me with a final, echoing clang that reverberated through the narrow passage. The tunnel was barely wide enough for my shoulders, the ceiling low, forcing me to stoop. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. My breath was ragged, visible in the beam. The sound of my own footsteps echoed unnervingly, each one seeming to stretch into an impossible distance. I moved deeper, the beam of my light dancing over crude carvings on the wall's strange symbols, faded and indecipherable, interspersed with what looked like crude, childlike stick figures. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Then I saw it. On a particularly damp section of the wall, amidst the symbols, was a drawing of a small figure, unmistakably a child, with crudely drawn tears streaming down its face. Next to it, in faint, almost erased letters, was a single name, a name I knew. A name I had whispered into the empty air of my own grief for months. It was impossible, this name here in this forgotten place. It was a cruel, impossible mockery. I stumbled back, hitting the damp wall with a sickening thud. It wasn't the dry rustle of leaves anymore. It was a voice, thin and reedy, a child's voice, distorted by unimaginable pain. It spoke the name again, my name, William, then followed it with a choked, agonizing sob. This was no draft. This was no settling house. This was something that knew me, that knew my pain, that was deliberately reaching for the rawest wound in my soul. The entity wasn't just in the house. It was of the house, rooted in its history, and it was feeding on my grief. I wasn't just an intruder, I was prey. The tunnel, the name, the child's sob, it all coalesced into a terrifying, undeniable truth. This place, this move, had been a terrible mistake. I had walked straight into a trap, and the jaws were now closing around me. I had to get out. The indistinct wash of gray light had faded, replaced by something far more insidious. My attempts to rationalize, to dismiss the chill that clung to my bones as mere drafts, the skittering sounds as settling wood, had crumbled. There was no more denying it. I was not alone in this house. The feeling had deepened, congealed into a heavy, suffocating certainty. It wasn't just a presence, it was an awareness, a malevolent consciousness that watched, waited, and I now understood fed. It fed on the fear that had begun as a trickle of unease and now threatened to become a torrent. A new determination solidified within me, cold and sharp. I had to fight back, or at the very least, escape. This wasn't just about my sanity anymore, it was about survival. But every cage, no matter how elaborate, must have an exit, or at least a weakness. I started my search in the deepest part of the house I knew, the cellar. The air grew heavy down there, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old like forgotten blood. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute black, illuminating shelves laden with forgotten jars and cobweb-draped tools. The walls were rough-hewn stone, patched in places with crumbling mortar. Then I found it. Hidden behind a stack of rotting firewood, a section of the stone wall felt different. The mortar lines were too regular, too deliberate. I pushed, at first gently, then with growing urgency. A rush of cold air carrying the unmistakable scent of deep earth and stagnant water spilled out. This was it, a hidden passage, an escape route, or perhaps the lair of whatever tormented me. Either way, it was a path forward, a chance to reclaim some control. I squeezed through the narrow opening, my flashlight beam swallowed almost immediately by the gloom ahead. I found myself in an underground tunnel system. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted of loam and decay. The walls were rough, unhewn rock, glistening with moisture. The floor was uneven earth, slick in places, making each step treacherous. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinthine maw swallowing my light and the meager courage I possessed. Each turn deepened the sense of entrapment, yet I pressed on, driven by the desperate need to find an end to this torment. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The silence was absolute, save for the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere ahead, echoing with an unnerving resonance. It was too soft to discern words, yet it carried an undeniable undercurrent of something malicious, something ancient. It was the entity I knew playing its game. The temperature plummeted further, a physical manifestation of its presence. My fingers, gripping the flashlight, grew numb. The beam flickered, a sudden alarming stutter that sent a spike of panic through me. I slapped the side of the casing and it steadied, but the message was clear. My control was tenuous. The tunnel narrowed, then widened, then branched into 3 identical passages. Which way? I chose the middle one, relying on a gut feeling that felt suspiciously like a puppet string being tugged. They spoke of despair, of loneliness, of things I had tried so desperately to bury. It was as if the entity was harvesting my very sorrow, making it its own. Then the tunnel began to shift, not physically but in my perception. The walls seemed to ripple, the stone to breathe. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but the distortions persisted. The air grew heavy, pressing in on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I stumbled, catching myself on a damp rock. I could feel it now, the entity not just observing, but actively manipulating my environment, twisting the very fabric of my reality within this underground tunnel system. It wasn't just a physical space. It was an extension of its will. A sudden, deafening roar echoed through the passages, not a natural sound, but something impossibly vast, a sound that vibrated in my teeth and rattled my bones. The ground beneath me trembled, and a shower of loose earth and small stones rained down from the ceiling. I cried out, covering my head, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. When the tremor subsided, the tunnel behind me was gone, replaced by a solid wall of freshly fallen rock, sealing off my path. My escape route had become a trap. I tried to push against the newly formed wall, scraping my hands raw on the jagged stone, but it was unyielding, solid. I spun around, my flashlight beam frantic, searching for an alternative. The path ahead remained an impenetrable black. It was a voice of ancient malice, devoid of warmth or pity, a voice that promised only unending suffering. "You are mine, William." The words weren't spoken but imprinted, seared onto my consciousness. This was no ordinary haunting. This was an entity that commanded the very structure of its domain, that could twist perception and manifest physical barriers at will. My attempts to fight back, to find an escape, were futile. I was not just in a dilapidated house. I was within its living, breathing prison. I sank to the damp earth, the flashlight beam wavering, reflecting the sheen of tears in my eyes. I was trapped. Utterly, irrevocably trapped, deep within the underground tunnel system with no way out and no hope of rescue. The house had swallowed me whole, and the entity, its true power now unveiled, was ready to begin its feast. The words didn't fade. They lodged themselves within me, a parasitic thought, an unholy echo that resonated through the very marrow of my bones. Twist perception. The phrase coiled, a venomous serpent, around every sensory input. The scent of dust and decay in the old house became the cloying sweetness of rot. The creak of settling timbers morphed into the deliberate drag of something heavy across floorboards above. The silence, once a welcome reprieve, now thrummed with a low, menacing hum, just beneath the threshold of hearing, a promise of unspeakable things. I couldn't stay in the upper rooms, couldn't endure another moment of the entity's psychological siege. Its presence was a palpable weight, pressing down from the ceiling, seeping up from the floorboards, whispering from the very walls. It was a suffocating blanket, stitched with my own fears. Driven by a desperate, almost animal instinct, I descended into the house's deepest recesses. My flashlight beam cut a trembling swath through the gloom, illuminating shelves laden with ancient, rusting tools and boxes filled with mildewed textiles. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and stale like old blood. I ran my hand along a rough stone wall, seeking purchase, seeking an answer, anything to ground me against the insidious unraveling of my mind. My heart gave a lurch, a painful spasm in my chest. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, to flee the house entirely. But the entity's grip was too tight. It had trapped me not just within these walls, but within my own unraveling thoughts. There was no escaping it, only confronting it, or so I hoped. With a grunt, I began to shift the crates, their wood splintering and groaning under my force. A tunnel. Not just a crawl space, but a proper, if narrow, passage, descending steeply into absolute blackness. The air that spilled out was icy, carrying the unmistakable scent of subterranean earth and stagnant water. This was it. This was the underground tunnel system I had heard vague, dismissive rumors about from the estate agent, dismissed as old service passages, nothing more. My mind, however, knew better. This was a vein, a hidden artery of the house, perhaps its true heart. The tunnel was rough-hewn, the walls damp stone and packed earth, smelling of rot and something else, something mineral and ancient. Water dripped somewhere far ahead, echoing like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The entity's presence sharpened. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the very air pressing against my skin. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of distorted pleas, agonized gasps, and a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the stone beneath my feet. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhalation a shallow, painful effort. My beam swept across ancient carvings on the walls, crude, unsettling figures, half human, half beast, twisted in agony. And then a symbol repeated again and again. A circle with a jagged tear through its center, like an eye weeping black tears. My gaze snagged on a section of the wall that seemed distinct, smoother, almost like a crude altar. On its surface, etched with surprising precision, were more symbols, accompanied by fragmented, archaic script. It spoke of a hunger, not for life but for despair. It wasn't the grief itself that fueled it, but the resistance to grief. The desperate clawing fight against the inevitable tide of sorrow. The more one struggled against the pain of loss, the more potent the entity became, feeding on that raw, unspent energy. It was a parasitic existence, drawing strength from the refusal to surrender to the natural process of mourning. All this time I had fought against the crushing weight of my own sorrow, tried to bury it, to outrun it, to escape it in this isolated house. And with every failed attempt, every moment of renewed anguish, I had only made it stronger. My unaddressed grief wasn't just a vulnerability, it was a feast. The tunnel system groaned. Dust rained down from the unseen ceiling. A low, resonant hum began, vibrating through the stone, shaking the very ground beneath me. It was the sound of something ancient, vast, and furious. The entity knew. It knew I had found its secret. I clutched the length of pipe, its cold metal a small comfort against the encroaching terror. The clue was here, etched into these forgotten stones. The way to defeat it wasn't a weapon or an exorcism, but a surrender. A surrender not to the entity, but to my own grief. To truly accept the loss, to let the pain wash over me, to feel it completely without fighting. It meant confronting the very thing I had fled from. But it also meant hope. The hum grew into a roar, the tunnel walls blurring at the edges of my vision. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the rough stone, the ancient symbols still burning in my mind. The scent of dust and decay in the old house became the cloying sweetness of something long dead, something preserved in its own rot. The shifting shadows, once just a trick of failing light, now seemed to writhe with a deliberate, hungry intelligence. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper, every gust of wind rattling the panes a mocking laugh. I stood in the library, the tattered remnants of old books mocking my search for answers. My hands trembled not with fear, but with a raw, vibrating energy that felt like a prelude to a seizure. My focus had sharpened, a terrible clarity born from the depths of despair. The entity wasn't just tormenting me, it was grooming me. Each psychological assault, each manipulation of my senses, was a deliberate erosion of myself, a preparation for something far more insidious than mere haunting. It wanted my grief. It craved the gaping wound left by my loss. But more than that, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, it wanted me. Not just my pain, but my very essence. It wanted to wear my skin, to inhabit my life, to become the grieving man in the dilapidated house. It fed on despair, yes, but its ultimate desire was to replace. The house wasn't just its lair, it was its chrysalis, and I, the unwitting sacrifice, it forged me. A furious resolve ignited, burning away the last vestiges of passive victimhood. I would not be consumed, I would not be replaced. The grief was mine, the memory was mine, and no ancient hungry thing would ever steal that from me. As I took a step, the floor beneath my boot groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the soles. The air in the library grew heavy, thick with an unseen resistance. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, coalescing into fleeting, indistinct shapes at the periphery of my vision. I needed to find the source, the anchor point of this malevolence. The main house was its playground, but I instinctively knew its true heart lay deeper, somewhere beneath the rotting foundations. I moved through the house, each room a gauntlet. The kitchen, once a place of mundane domesticity, now felt like a predatory maw. As I passed, a rusty pot fell from a shelf with a deafening clang, skittering across the flagstones towards my feet, a deliberate, aggressive gesture. I ignored it, my gaze fixed on the cellar door. It stood at the end of the main hallway, a thick oak slab scarred and pitted. I had avoided it for weeks, a subconscious repulsion guiding me away. Now it beckoned with a terrible allure. As I approached, the wood seemed to warp and twist, the grain undulating like muscle beneath skin. I yanked it open. A rush of frigid air, laden with the scent of damp earth and something indefinable, a mineral sweetness, like crushed bone, billowed out. I fumbled for the lantern I'd prepared days ago, a battered old thing with a cracked glass pane. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten things, decaying crates, rusted tools, skeletal remains of furniture draped in cobwebs. But it wasn't the main cellar I was interested in. My eyes, now sharpened by my terrible clarity, scanned the furthest wall, where the stonework looked different, subtly newer, more deliberate. There, almost completely obscured by a stack of moldering firewood, was an archway, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It led to a steep, uneven set of stone steps, plunging into an even deeper blackness. This was it, the entry point. The house itself seemed to recoil around me, groaning, shifting. The floorboards above creaked as if an unseen weight was pacing, agitated. A distant window shattered with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the empty rooms, a cry of rage from the entity. It knew my intent. It was fighting back, trying to prevent my descent. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my bones, tightened around the lantern. The air grew heavier with each step I took down the rough-hewn stairs, the stone slick with condensation, the walls pressing in. The metallic, earthy smell intensified, growing richer, almost palatable. The sounds of the house faded behind me, replaced by the guttural thrum of the earth itself, and a faint, rhythmic drip somewhere ahead. I reached the bottom, my boots sinking into a thin layer of fine, damp silt. Before me stretched a narrow, winding passage, a true underground tunnel system. The walls, rough-hewn stone and packed earth, wept moisture, glistening like the skin of some subterranean creature. Roots, thick as my forearm, snaked through cracks, seeking purchase, some still dripping with clear, viscous fluid. This was its domain. This was where it truly resided, where it had waited through centuries, feeding on whatever sorrow seeped down from the world above. My grief was just the latest, the richest feast, but I wasn't here to be devoured. I was here to confront it. My knuckles were white on the lantern's handle, my jaw tight. The entity wanted my life. The scent of dust and decay in the old house became the cloying sweetness of rot, the creak of floorboards a mocking whisper. My own reflection in the grimy window pane was no longer me, but a gaunt, wide-eyed stranger, a puppet of sorrow. Yet beneath the veneer of manufactured madness, a cold, hard kernel of defiance had solidified. I would not break. I would not yield. The entity wanted to unravel me piece by agonizing piece. But if my perception was its weapon, then understanding that manipulation was my shield. I gripped the heavy iron lantern, its feeble glow cutting a pathetic swath through the encroaching gloom. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a pressure against my eardrums. It wanted me to run, to cower. Instead, I pressed on, my footsteps echoing with an unnatural clarity through the silent house. I descended into the cellar, the rough-hewn stone steps slick with a perpetual dampness that seeped into my worn boots. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten things, broken furniture shrouded in cobwebs, empty preserved jars like vacant eyes, and the persistent earthy smell of buried secrets. My gaze swept across the far wall, where a faint seam in the stone hinted at something more, a hidden passage. My fingers, trembling not from fear but from a surge of desperate resolve, traced the outline. It was a crude door, almost perfectly camouflaged, built not to conceal a treasure, but to bury a truth. With a groan of rusted hinges that sounded like a dying breath, the hidden door gave way. A blast of stale, frigid air assaulted me, carrying with it the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something ancient and deeply malevolent. Beyond the threshold, a narrow, sloping passage plunged into absolute blackness. This was it, the heart of it all. I stepped inside, the stone walls pressing in immediately, the ceiling so low I had to stoop. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, a mix of packed earth and loose shale, making every step a conscious effort. I could feel the entity now, not as a distinct form, but as a pervasive, suffocating awareness. The tunnel twisted and turned, a serpentine path deeper into the earth. Each turn brought a fresh assault on my senses. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the cold stone beneath my hand, the rough texture of the wall. Twist perception. I repeated the phrase like a mantra, a defiance against its insidious power. Then a flicker, not of light but of memory. A vision sharp and cruel of her smile, the way her hair caught the sunlight. It was so real, so vivid, it stole my breath. This was the entity's true power, its true horror. It didn't just feed on despair. It cultivated it, replanted it in the fertile soil of my guilt, twisting the most precious memories into weapons. Further in, the tunnel opened into a small, irregular cavern. In the center, almost perfectly preserved despite the damp, lay a collection of objects on a raised slab of rock. A child's wooden toy, a tarnished silver locket, a dried flower pressed between two yellowed pages of a small, leather-bound journal. The journal. My fingers, numb with a sudden horror, reached for it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the script was clear enough. It was a confession, a desperate, rambling account from a previous occupant of the house. It demands the sorrow, it twists the mind. It makes you see what it wants you to see, hear what it wants you to hear. It feeds on the breaking of the spirit. I saw her, my daughter, suffering, always suffering, until I could no longer bear the sight of her pain, even though he was long gone. It wanted me to believe I caused it, and I did. I let it consume me. The words were a mirror, reflecting my own torment. This was the reveal. The entity wasn't just a malevolent force, it was a predator of grief, a sculptor of delusion. It didn't kill, it broke. It didn't just haunt, it rewrote reality, not for me, but within me. My own grief, raw and unaddressed, had been an open wound, an invitation. As the realization solidified, the air around me crackled. Her face, contorted in agony, appeared again, larger, closer, screaming my name. The entity was here, fully present, celebrating its victory, ready to feast on my final descent into madness. But something shifted within me. The horror was immense, yes, but so was the clarity. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about what I would allow this thing to do to my memory of her, to my own soul. I had been a victim of circumstance, then a victim of this entity's design, but I would not be a victim of my own perception. I opened them again, gazing not at the spectral tormentor, but at the crude altar, at the journal. It had wanted me to believe I was solely responsible, that my grief was a punishment. It wanted me to drown in that manufactured guilt. No, my grief was real, her loss was real. But the entity's version of it, the endless, agonizing loop of self-blame, that was a lie. I would not let it twist her memory into a weapon against me. I would not let it make me hate myself or her or the world. I would face the raw, unvarnished truth of her absence, without the entity's poisoned lens. The entity howled, a sound of pure, frustrated rage that vibrated through the very stone beneath my feet. It was a sound of a feast denied. The air in the underground tunnel system was a thick, cloying breath of damp earth and something metallic, like old pennies left to rust. I moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose bones felt like brittle glass, each step a gamble against the darkness. My left arm throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that resonated with the hollow echo of my own breathing. I couldn't recall the exact moment I'd stumbled into this subterranean labyrinth, only the desperate, instinctive need to flee the house, to put as much stone and soil between myself and the gnawing presence that had consumed my world. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a perversion, a parasitic intelligence that didn't desire death, but dissolution. It wanted to unravel me, thread by thread, until my very identity was a tapestry of its own making. My grief, unaddressed and festering, had been an open wound, a gaping maw for it to feed upon. The words echoing in my head like a broken record had been a mirror, showing me the monstrosity it had made of my sorrow. My fingers, scraped and raw, traced the rough-hewn rock, seeking purchase, seeking direction. There was no light, save for the pathetic glow of my phone, its battery icon a grim, red sliver. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water, a sound that amplified the frantic rhythm of my own heart. A profound weariness settled over me, heavier than the damp air. My mind, however, refused to rest, not to terrify me into submission, but to break me down, to sculpt my despair into a feast. That was its trick. It didn't just show me horrors, it made me create them, using my deepest pain as its clay. The realization was a bitter draft burning down my throat. I had been a willing participant, albeit unknowingly, in my own undoing, but now I understood. And understanding, I hoped, was the first step towards defiance. The entity thrived on the raw, unprocessed grief, on the despair that kept me chained to the past. If I could sever that connection, if I could starve it, perhaps I could reclaim myself. It wouldn't be easy. The grief was a part of me, a deep-seated ache that had defined my existence since the tragedy. To let go of it felt like letting go of her entirely, a betrayal I couldn't countenance. Yet to hold onto it, to cling to the pain, was to offer myself up piece by piece to the predator. I pushed myself away from the wall, a new resolve stiffening my spine. This wasn't about fighting a monster with fists or fire. It was about fighting it with my own mind, my own will. I had to acknowledge the grief, yes, but not wallow in it. I had to process it, to mourn, to remember, but not to surrender. I chose one not out of any sense of direction, but out of a desperate need for forward momentum. Was it the tunnel settling, or was it the house above, groaning under its own weight, under the weight of its history? The metallic smell intensified, mingling with a faint, sweet decay. I stumbled, my hand landing in something viscous, slick. I recoiled, my stomach lurching, but forced myself to breathe, to push back the surge of panic. It was just mud, mixed with something organic, something long dead. I couldn't. I walked, or rather shuffled, for what felt like hours. The tunnel narrowed, then widened, the air occasionally stirring with a draft that hinted at an opening, a way out. I forced myself to recall the joy, the love, the life we shared, not the agonizing emptiness that remained. It was a battle fought in the deep recesses of my own mind, a silent, desperate war against the insidious tendrils of despair. Each time a shadow of dread tried to creep in, I pushed it back with a concrete memory of light. It was exhausting, a constant, draining effort, but I felt a subtle shift, a faint, almost imperceptible loosening of the entity's grip. Then a faint, gray light appeared ahead, a distant promise of the outside world. It was not the brilliant blaze of the sun, but a weak, diffused glow, hinting at dawn or an overcast sky. I stumbled towards it, my heart racing not with fear but with a desperate, fragile hope. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, not the metallic decay of the tunnel. I crawled out, my body screaming in protest, into a dense thicket of overgrown shrubs and brambles. Above me, the sky was a bruised, pre-dawn purple, the air frigid. It had not been vanquished, it had merely been starved for now. The grief remained, a wound that needed to heal, not just to be bandaged. And I, William, was a man forever changed, carrying the scars of a horror that had not sought to kill my body, but to devour my very soul.